Mayday! Mayday! This is Flight 209. We're going down.
Captain Lee's voice was a beacon of distress amidst the storm.
What's happening, Captain?
The co-pilot yelled, her hands a blur over the instrument panel.
Engine 2's gone. We're losing altitude fast.
Captain Lee barked back, his eyes fixed on the sea rushing up to meet them. Passengers screamed and sobbed, their voices a tangled symphony of fear. A woman cried out to a stranger beside her. The co-pilot, struggling to maintain composure, chanted her training mantra.
Brace positions now. Heads down, stay down.
And with a final, desperate plea from the cockpit.
Control, we're in God's hands now.
The plane succumbed to gravity's merciless pull. The silence in the house was deafening. It had been a year since the plane carrying Molly and Ian vanished over the Pacific. A year of unanswered calls, untouched toys, and a half-eaten breakfast that turned to stone on the table. George, a brilliant scientist, moved through his days like a ghost, his research an escape that no longer soothed the gaping wound in his heart. One night, fueled by a sleepless night and a mountain of grief, George stumbled upon an article about a groundbreaking experiment in Japan. Scientists had successfully cloned a monkey. A tiny flicker ignited in the darkness, a desperate hope. Could he use this technology, still in its infancy, to bring Molly and Ian back? Guilt warred with desperation within him. Was it even possible? Was it right? But the thought of never seeing their faces again, of never hearing their laughter, was unbearable. He dove headfirst into research, devouring every scrap of information on cloning he could find. His lab became a shrine to his lost family. Pictures adorned the walls, capturing Molly's infectious smile and Ian's goofy grin. He kept a worn teddy bear Ian always carried close, its fur matted with sleep-dribbled tears. Surrounded by these reminders, George painstakingly developed a secret plan. The process was intricate and dangerous. He needed Molly's DNA. He found it in a hairbrush tucked away in a drawer, a forgotten remnant of a life stolen. Ian's DNA was more challenging, but a discarded blood test kit from a routine doctor's visit provided the answer. He knew these were fragile samples, long shots at best, but it was all he had. But where would these clones grow? Traditional surrogacy was too risky, with a high chance of rejection. He spent months scouring ethical guidelines and scientific journals before coming across a controversial method, using genetically modified sheep as surrogate mothers. The next step was the most challenging. Setting up a hidden facility was a logistical nightmare. He rented an abandoned farmhouse miles outside the city, filled it with stolen equipment, and rigged up a sophisticated security system. It was a scientist's lair born of grief, a sanctuary for his forbidden experiment. Months turned into a year as George meticulously prepped the lab. He built incubators, sterilized instruments, and trained himself on the complex procedures. Each day was a battle against time and self-doubt, the weight of his secret threatening to crush him. Finally, the day arrived. With trembling hands, he injected the genetic material into the prepared embryos. As he watched them nestled in their sterilized chambers, a fragile hope bloomed in his chest. These were microscopic possibilities, but possibilities nonetheless. Days bled into excruciating weeks. George checked on the embryos every waking moment, monitoring their development with a scientist's precision and a father's yearning. He named them Molly Jr. and Ian Jr., a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between reality and his fabricated hope. One morning, a faint flicker of life appeared on the monitor. Relief washed over him, so profound it almost brought him to his knees. It wasn't confirmation, but it was a sign, a whisper of possibility. Days later, another flicker joined the first, a faint heartbeat echoing in the sterile lab. Tears streamed down George's face, a mixture of grief and overwhelming hope. The next stage was even more critical. He carefully implanted the healthy embryos into the surrogate mothers at a hidden veterinary clinic. Each long week felt like an eternity as he waited for confirmation. Finally, the call came. Both sheep were pregnant. His heart hammered in his chest as a mix of excitement and fear gnawed at him. Had it worked? Had he defied death? 9 months later, Molly Jr. arrived first. A healthy baby girl with eyes that held a startling echo of Molly's blue. A week later, Ian Jr. followed, a smaller version of his brother with Molly's dark curls. Holding them in his arms, George felt a bittersweet ache. These weren't Molly and Ian, but reflections, memories sculpted from his grief. Yet, their presence brought back a warmth he thought was lost forever. He showered them with love, surrounding them with pictures and stories of their past lives. He enrolled them in homeschool, weaving their fabricated pasts with lessons about the real world. Every bedtime story, every game of peekaboo, was laced with a pang of guilt and the constant reminder of what he'd done. Molly Jr. and Ian Jr. thrived. Molly Jr., with her gentle spirit, was the image of her namesake. Ian Jr., full of boundless energy, held a spark that reminded George of his son. But there were moments, fleeting expressions, that hinted at a deeper unease within them. One day, while exploring the abandoned house next door, Molly Jr. stumbled upon a hidden room. Inside, she found lab equipment, scientific journals, and Molly Jr. stared in disbelief at the room filled with scientific equipment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Wires snaked across tables, strange machines hummed in the dim light, and folders labeled with scientific jargon lay scattered on a desk. This room, hidden behind a loose brick in the wall, held secrets her father had never mentioned. Terror clawed at her. Why did her father have this hidden lab? What was he doing here? She carefully picked up a folder, its worn cover reading Project Genesis. Inside, scientific diagrams and complex equations swam before her eyes. Then a picture of her mother, Molly, smiling brightly at the camera. But something was off. It was a younger Molly, a different Molly than the one she knew from the photo albums. Panic surged through Molly Jr. Was this some kind of joke? A Halloween costume gone wrong? She flipped through the folder, her stomach churning with each page. There were notes about DNA, genetic modification, and a term she barely recognized, cloning. Suddenly, a horrible realization dawned on her. A wave of nausea washed over her as she remembered her father's odd behavior, the frequent trips to the farmhouse, the late nights spent working in his lab. It all clicked into place. A chilling question echoed in her mind. Was she real? Overcome with a wave of confusion and fear, Molly Jr. ran back to the farmhouse, the folder clutched tightly in her hand. She burst into the living room, where Ian Jr. sat reading a book. "Ian," she gasped, her voice trembling. "We need to talk about Dad." As she explained what she'd found, Ian Jr.'s face went pale. He remembered the strange trips to the vet, the hushed conversations, the way Dad would always avoid their questions about his late nights. A seed of doubt, long buried, sprouted in his heart. The next morning, they confronted George. Tears streamed down Molly Jr.'s face as she held up the photo. "Dad, what does this mean?" she demanded. George's face paled, the color draining from his cheeks like a deflated balloon. His secret, the burden he had carried for years, was finally out in the open. Shame washed over him. He knew he could no longer hide the truth. He confessed everything, his voice thick with remorse. He told them about his grief, his desperation, and his reckless attempt to bring their family back. Molly Jr. and Ian Jr. were devastated. Anger and betrayal mixed with a strange existential confusion. They were not Molly and Ian, but echoes, copies created in a lab. Their entire lives, their memories, everything they thought they knew, were a carefully constructed lie. Days turned into weeks as George tried to piece together their fractured trust. He apologized profusely, explaining his love for them, the genuine desire to have his family back in any form. But the damage was done. Their world had cracked open, revealing a reality far more unsettling than they could have imagined. One evening, Ian Jr. found Molly Jr. staring out the window, tears glistening on her cheeks. "I feel like a fake," he admitted, his voice strained. "Like a copy of someone who lived a life I never did." Molly Jr. turned to him, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "Then let's learn about them, about the lives Dad stole from us. Together, They dove into the photo albums, their fabricated pasts becoming a bridge to their real parents. George, humbled by their resilience, decided to come clean. He contacted a renowned bioethicist, Dr. Evelyn Wright, who specialized in the ethical implications of genetic engineering. Dr. Wright, initially skeptical, was moved by George's story and the plight of Molly Jr. and Ian Jr. With Dr. Wright's help, George held a press conference. He confessed his actions, the hidden lab, and the cloning process. The world was stunned. Public outcry was swift, with accusations of playing God and tampering with human life. But amidst the backlash, a new conversation emerged. Molly Jr. and Ian Jr., their faces a mask of determination, stepped forward. They spoke of their confusion, their anger, and ultimately, their desire to understand their place in the world. Their story ignited a global debate. Was cloning ethical in any form? What rights did clones have? Slowly, the tide began to turn. Support groups for clones and bioengineered beings emerged, offering a sense of community and shared experiences. Years passed. Molly Jr. and Ian Jr. became leading voices in the clone rights movement. They advocated for stricter regulations on genetic engineering, ensuring informed consent and ethical practices. George, ostracized from the scientific community, became their unwavering supporter. He dedicated himself to ensuring his mistakes wouldn't be repeated. One day, Dr. Wright contacted George, her voice filled with urgency.
There's been a development. A shadowy corporation, Genesis Corporation, has been experimenting with cloning technology. It's far more dangerous than anything you ever did.
George's heart sank. He knew the dangers of unregulated cloning firsthand. What are they doing? He asked, a tremor in his voice.
They're creating an army, clones of soldiers, programmed for obedience and violence.
The weight of his actions settled on George's shoulders with a new heaviness. His mistake had become a spark that could ignite a global firestorm. Dr. Wright explained Genesis Corporation had infiltrated online communities for clones, manipulating their anger and desperation. They offered a twisted sense of belonging, a purpose for their existence built on violence. Dr. Wright feared a catastrophic event, a clone uprising orchestrated by Genesis Corp. Determined to atone, George joined forces with Dr. Wright and Molly Jr. and Ian Jr. They used their knowledge and connections to expose Genesis Corp's activities. Molly Jr. and Ian Jr. became reluctant heroes, their personal story a powerful weapon against the corporation's twisted agenda. Together, they formed a clandestine task force, working with sympathetic journalists and law enforcement officials. They gathered evidence, infiltrated online forums, and pieced together Genesis Corp's plans. The closer they got, the more danger they faced. Genesis Corporation, realizing they were being exposed, sent goons after them, forcing them to live a life on the run. One night, after a harrowing escape from a deserted warehouse, Molly Jr. broke down. "This is all because of Dad," she cried. "Because he couldn't let go." George, his face etched with guilt, knelt beside her. "Yes, it is," he admitted. "But you and Ian are not mistakes. You are strong, brave, and determined. You can help stop this." Molly Jr. looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and grudging respect. "We can try," she said, wiping away a stray tear. Their investigation led them to a hidden facility, a sprawling underground complex housing Genesis Corp's cloning labs. Infiltrating the facility was a suicide mission, but they had no choice. Inside, they witnessed rows upon rows of cloning pods, each one containing a developing clone, blank slates programmed for violence. A tense chase ensued, culminating in a heart-stopping showdown with the head of Genesis Corporation, a ruthless businessman driven by a warped sense of power. He saw clones not as people but as tools, the next step in human evolution. In the end, it was Ian Jr., fueled by a desire to protect his fabricated family and the world at large, who disarmed the scientist controlling the cloning process. Genesis Corp's plans were thwarted, the facility shut down, and hundreds of clones saved from a brutal fate. The aftermath was messy. George, though not entirely redeemed, was hailed as a whistleblower who exposed a dangerous corporation. Molly Jr. and Ian Jr. became symbols of hope, living testaments to the dangers of scientific manipulation but also the resilience of the human spirit. Years later, George sat with Molly Jr. and Ian Jr., watching a news report on the passing of the first global cloning rights bill. It was a bittersweet victory, a reminder of the long road they had walked. "We did it, Dad," Molly Jr. said, a smile playing on her lips. George nodded, his own smile tinged with sadness. "We did," he said, "but don't ever forget the cost."